The billionaire had always trusted his wife to behave with grace, but today in the hospital lobby, he froze as he watched her yelling at a young black nurse over a minor mistake the nurse had barely made the nurse. Dressed in her crisp uniform, held back tears as his wife mocked her in front of patients and staff. The billionaire's heart raced, anger and disappointment mixing into a storm. He quietly approached his wife and whispered something only she could hear before turning his gaze to the shaken nurse. He gave her a reassuring nod and a small smile that instantly eased her fear. Later that evening, he called the hospital administration and asked to see the surveillance footage to make sure they had witnessed what happened. But he also had a plan he had spent weeks perfecting. He wanted to teach his wife a lesson in humility and show the world that cruelty had consequences. The next day, the nurse was called into the CEO's office. Confused and nervous, only then did she realize that the billionaire had used his power to not only protect her, but also to expose the arrogance of his wife. He handed her a letter and said, "You have been promoted effective immediately, and your salary has been doubled." Everyone in the hospital was stunned as the news spread like wildfire. The same wife who had humiliated the nurse was now facing a board inquiry for inappropriate conduct, and bullying. The hospital could not ignore the situation any longer, and she was publicly reprimanded. The nurse stood tall for the first time in weeks and thanked the billionaire for believing in her and standing up for what was right. But here is the question: have you ever witnessed someone using power to defend the innocent and felt a mix of shock and awe? It was a moment that reminded everyone in the hospital that kindness and courage could not be silenced. Meanwhile, the billionaire returned home, feeling a strange satisfaction, knowing justice had been served in a way that no one would forget. His wife tried to apologize, but the damage was done, and he made it clear that respect and decency would always come before loyalty to someone who thrived on cruelty. The nurse went on to become one of the most respected members of the hospital staff, and whenever she walked through the lobby, she remembered the day her dignity was restored by someone who truly understood the power of standing up for what was right. I never thought a simple fence could start a war, but in my case it did. My name's Luke Turner, and for 3 generations, my family owned a 50-acre ranch just outside Cedar Hills, a peaceful town until the HOA decided they owned everything that touched their clipboard. The day I came back from a cattle auction and saw new HOA property signs hammered into my front pasture, I knew something dark was brewing. My land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was my father's legacy, my late mother's garden, and the place where every memory I cared about was rooted deep in the soil. But to Karen Miller, the HOA president, it was underutilized community space. She stood there, clipboard in hand, smile sharper than barbed wire. "Luke, dear," she said, "the board voted to allocate the east section of your ranch for our new community garden. It'll raise property values." I nearly dropped the postal digger I was holding. My land. My fence, my rules. But she didn't care. She had the arrogance of someone who thought bylaws meant ownership. When I told her she had no right, she smirked. "You didn't attend the last meeting, so the vote passed unanimously. It's public record now." That night, I sat on my porch watching the sun sink over the stolen pasture, anger burning hotter than the horizon. My father's voice echoed in my head. "Don't let anyone fence you out of what's yours, son." I wasn't about to. Over the next few days, I visited the county clerk's office, pored over every document, and sure enough, Karen had pulled some legal gymnastics. She filed a temporary usage deed without notifying me. It was fraud dressed in fancy words. By the weekend, construction crews were already rolling in, tearing down my old fence, flattening the soil. My blood boiled as they drove stakes where my cattle used to graze. When I confronted the workers, they shrugged. "Talk to the HOA, man. We're just following orders." Orders. Like my family's land was just another checkbox. That night, I couldn't sleep. The creak of my old ranch house felt heavier, like the walls themselves were angry. So I started sketching. Plans. Blueprints. Revenge, not with fists or lawyers, but with something much stronger. I'd build a fence so smart, so defiant, that the HOA would wish they'd never laid eyes on my property line. But I needed to bide my time, play their game before I flipped the board. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the HOA demanding cooperation or legal consequences. That was my final push. I'd had enough of their threats, their fake smiles, their obsession with control. I looked out at my pasture, my land stripped bare, and I promised myself one thing. Karen Miller and her HOA army were about to learn the hard way what happens when you mess with a Turner's Ranch. But before I started building, I needed to ask myself one question, and maybe you should too. If someone took something your family built with their bare hands, would you fight back or walk away? Let me know your answer down below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for the next part, because trust me, you're not going to believe what I did next. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I prefer to think of it as a trap set with patience and craftsmanship. The first thing I learned from my father was that the land remembers how you treat it. If you listen, it tells you where to dig your roots and where to hide your plans. So I didn't rush to haul lumber and nail posts like some hot-headed maniac. I turned the anger into engineering and the fury into stealth. I needed a fence that did more than mark a boundary. This one would be a lesson dressed in timber and steel. I started by mapping everything. Property lines, survey markers, utility easements, the narrow dirt lane the HOA trucks used to access the disputed pasture, even the old drainage ditch that ran hidden beneath the grass. I spent afternoons hunched over satellite images and blueprints, tracing coordinates with a ruler and a stubborn jaw. If Karen thought she could outlegal me, she hadn't reckoned with the patience of a man who had fed cows at dawn for 20 years. There were allies in odd places. Old Mr. Delgado from the county survey office owed my father a favor from years ago when Dad had fixed his fence after a storm. Delgado dug through dusty files and pulled out a forgotten survey from the 70s showing a faint iron stake where my property's true corner lay. That stake had been overlooked by the HOA's attorneys because it was half swallowed by the hedge line. Suddenly, the map shifted in my favor by a strip of land wide enough to make a difference. I smiled and thanked Delgado with a jar of my mother's pickled peaches and a promise to help with his roof when winter came. Next, I needed materials and secrecy. A normal fence wouldn't cut it. I wanted something that declared ownership and invited curiosity, something the HOA couldn't ignore and that would complicate their grand plans. I ordered reclaimed oak posts from an old mill 3 counties over, the kind of wood with knots like old scars and a grain that tells stories when you run your hand along it. The mill owner, a wiry woman named June, wrapped the rails and dropped them off after dusk in the storage shed behind my barn. June didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations. People who respect dirt and timber tend to know when to leave a man to his work. Construction began at midnight. Not because I was sneaky for the sake of it, but because I wanted to avoid gossip and sabotage. Karen loved drama and a crowd. I refused to give her the spectacle. My crew was small. Me, my cousin Ava, who could drive a post driver like she was born with it, and Carl the mechanic who owed me a favor for fixing his truck last year. We worked in shifts, rotating to keep the fence rising while keeping the world thinking nothing important was happening on my property. In the dark, the fence took on the look of a slow-moving tide, rising plank by plank along the real line my father taught me to measure by heart. But the real genius wasn't in the oak or the height. It was in the foundation. Where the HOA had been careless, I was meticulous. I dug deep, lining post holes with rebar and concrete mined from old foundations I'd demolished for other projects. I set hidden anchors and bolted steel plates where the rails would meet so the fence would not just stand but endure. I installed a narrow trough beneath the bottom rail that could be filled or drained with water depending on the season. Something innocuous but practical for the cattle and maddening for anyone who planned to walk a protest line through my land. Practicality disguised as provocation. I also engineered a gate unlike any Karen had seen at a neighborhood picnic. It was handcrafted, double-hinged, heavy as a barn door, and adorned with my family's brand ironed into a steel plate at its center. The brand was simple, a looping T nested inside a circle, the same my grandfather used on calves. It felt like burning a signature into the property itself. The gate had a latch system that required a key I kept in a weatherproof box buried under an old juniper tree. I imagine the HOA's smug faces when they realized there was a key, but no way to get to it without treading on land we own by right. There's a special kind of poetry in locking something back into its rightful place. Of course, Karen wasn't a fool. She had eyes and ears all over town, the kind that showed up smiling at potlucks and skulked around at 3 in the morning. She sent a volunteer committee to inspect progress and report back. They came like vultures in floral dresses, clipboard clutching and whispering. We greeted them with cold coffee and polite nods, told them building permits were filed, that everything was above board, which was true in its bones. I had the paperwork stamped, the surveys signed, and the permits in order thanks to Delgado in June and more than a little stubborn honesty. If Karen's play was to manufacture outrage by gaslighting the town, she needed smoke and mirrors. I gave her neither. I gave her documents. Still, paperwork doesn't win hearts. It doesn't stop a smear campaign or the phone calls from neighbors who'd swallowed Karen's talking points hook, line, and sinker. So I arranged something else. The first neighbor I invited over was Mrs. Patel across the lane, a widow who'd once taken to my mother's children when sickness kept my parents in bed. I built a small bench by the fence and installed a trough where she could water her potted herbs. I fixed the old solar light by her mailbox and rewired the shed roof so rainwater would run into a barrel she could use for a garden. Simple kindnesses like these built alliances that Karen's petitions could not punch through. When the HOA called a community meeting to vote on evicting my cattle and extending their garden, several neighbors showed up with stories about shared fences mended at my expense and favors I'd done without fanfare. The room's mood shifted from righteous indignation to embarrassment for Karen's bullying. By the time the fence stood fully built and the gate hung heavy and true, it was more than wood and iron. It was a statement. It was 3 generations of stubbornness nailed into the ground. The next step was deliberate and slow. I planned a reveal that would present the fence not as a provocation, but as a restoration. Publicity was a double-edged sword. Too much, and Karen would spin it into scandal. Too little, and they'd chalk it up to one man's tantrum. So I chose the middle road. I arranged for the county surveyor to walk the line publicly, for Delgado to testify to the original stake, and for the neighbors to be invited to an afternoon barbecue at my place under the pretense of a harvest party. I wanted witnesses, not witnesses summoned by the HOA, but ones who came because they'd been invited. And I built one last thing into the gate, a small plaque reading Turner Ranch as 1954, nothing rude, no threats, just the truth visible to anyone who cared to read it. Sometimes the simplest facts cut deeper than any scream. When the day came for the survey and the barbecue, it felt less like victory and more like setting a trap where the town's conscience would trip. Karen would come, I knew. She would clutch her clipboard and gather her minions and deliver the performance she thought would shame me. She never understood that land is stubborn the way people are, and that when you plant roots deep enough, they push back against anyone trying to pull them up. The barbecue day arrived hot and bright, like the land itself wanted to witness justice. The smell of oak smoke and brisket drifted through the air as neighbors started trickling in, drawn by curiosity and free food. Kids ran by with plates of cornbread and potato salad. Dogs barked, and for a few hours it almost felt like old Cedar Hills before the HOA turned neighborly living into rulebooks and fines. But under the laughter, tension hummed like a live wire. Everyone knew Karen Miller would show up, and she did. Right on schedule, heels clicking, sunglasses gleaming, clipboard clutched like a sword. Behind her marched her loyal compliance committee, for retirees who believed every mailbox color and lawn height was a holy matter. They approached the gate, the brand-new oak and steel structure gleaming under the sun, and I could see the anger tighten Karen's jaw when she noticed the Turner Ranch plaque bolted proudly at eye level. "Luke Turner," she began, loud enough for the crowd to hush, "this structure violates community design standards. You had no authorization to build such a fortress." I smiled calmly and handed her a stamped document from the county surveyor, signed, sealed, and legal. "Actually, Karen, this isn't community property. That stake," I said, pointing to the gleaming iron post Delgado had uncovered, "proves the HOA's so-called garden sits 5 feet inside Turnerland." The surveyor nodded beside me. "Mr. Turner's fence marks his rightful boundary." The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily as realization spread. Karen's smile faltered, her perfect composure cracking like dry paint. "That can't be correct," she hissed. "The board approved." "The board approved something they didn't own," I interrupted. "You took what wasn't yours. That's called trespassing." A few neighbors gasped. Mrs. Patel crossed her arms and said softly but clearly, "We all told you not to mess with Luke's land." Karen tried to recover her authority. "We'll see what the legal department says." "Oh, we will," I said, "because while you were busy holding secret votes, I filed a property grievance with the county." I turned to the crowd, lifting my voice. "They ruled in my favor this morning." I held up the county's letter, its seal glinting in the sunlight. "This fence is staying. The garden, your so-called community project, is coming down." Silence fell heavy for a heartbeat. Then whispers rippled like wind through wheat. One of Karen's committee members muttered. She said it was HOA land. Another added, "I told you this would backfire." Karen's eyes darted around like a trapped fox. "This isn't over, Luke. You can't just embarrass the board like this." "Oh, I think I can," I replied evenly. "Because the county's not the only one who knows. About every meeting recording you try to hide, every fake signature you forged, and every resident you threatened with fines. You gave away land you didn't own. You used my ranch to raise money for your pet project." I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough for her to feel the weight of each word. "Now the town knows what kind of president you are." Karen's face turned pale. She spun on her heel and stormed off, her committee scrambling after her. The crowd buzzed louder, some angry, some relieved, but mostly proud that someone had finally stood up to her tyranny. Still, I knew she wasn't done. Karen wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat quietly. She'd find another angle, another rule, another threat. I just didn't expect her next move to come so fast. That night, after the last guest left and the crickets took over the airwaves, I noticed headlights crawling down the dirt lane. 2 SUVs, HOA vehicles. They stopped near the gate, and figures stepped out, Karen and a few of her enforcers, armed with flashlights and bolt cutters. I watched from the porch in the dark, fury boiling beneath my calm. They were cutting through the fence, my fence, after everything that had just happened. That was when I knew it wasn't just about power anymore. It was about pride, ego, and control. She couldn't stand that a rancher had outsmarted her. So I walked down the path quietly, boots crunching gravel, my old dog growling low beside me. "Evening, Karen," I said, voice steady. Her flashlight beam jerked, catching me mid-stride. "Working late." She froze, realizing she was caught red-handed. "We're performing an emergency inspection," she stammered. "Your fence encroaches." "Save it," I said, stepping closer. "You already lost that argument. You touch one more board, and I'll have the sheriff here in 5 minutes." One of her men muttered, "Let's go, Karen." She hesitated, glaring at me, then turned sharply toward the SUV. "This isn't over, Turner," she shouted as the tires kicked up dust. But deep down I knew it was, because she'd just given me all the proof I needed, caught trespassing, damaging private property, in front of my security camera hidden in the oak tree by the gate. The next morning, I downloaded the footage and sent it straight to the county office. I didn't have to lift a finger after that. Word spread fast. By noon, neighbors were calling me to say the HOA emergency meeting had turned into chaos. Karen was being investigated for fraud, property damage, and misuse of funds. That night, I sat again on my porch, the smell of oak smoke in the air, the fence gleaming in the moonlight like a sentinel. I didn't cheer, didn't gloat. I just whispered to the wind, "That's for you, Dad." But what happened next? Well, even I didn't see that coming. Because when power slips from tyrants' hands, they don't just vanish quietly. They drag everything down with them. Would you have confronted Karen that night, or waited until the law handled her? Tell me what you'd do in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe before we dive into the final part, because her downfall hadn't even hit its peak yet. When the county called Karen to the office, I thought it would be quiet work done behind closed doors and signed forms. I was wrong. People don't fall from power quietly anymore, not when smartphones are glued to palms, and every whisper can become a headline. The footage of Karen and her volunteers cutting my fence went viral the moment the county released it as evidence, and the town's chatter turned into a roar. Reporters came first as curiosity, then as consequence. Lights and microphones and questions lined up like a bad storm on my front lane. The first reporter to get to my porch was a wiry woman from the state paper who'd been covering small-town politics for years. She asked the kind of question that sits in your chest and won't leave. How did you know when to stand up? I thought of my father's hands, cracked and sure, and the way he'd taught me to measure corners by eye and by heart. I told her the truth about the stake Delgado found, about June's help, about the neighbors who remembered favors and kindnesses and not bylaws. She scribbled and nodded and asked if she could use my name. I said yes because truth needed witnesses. Karen's downfall didn't happen from a single clip or a single court filing. It was accumulation, tiny details that stacked until her whole castle of control collapsed. A bank statement showing questionable HOA disbursements. An audio recording of a board meeting where she joked about using Turner's land to kickstart a beautification fund. A batch of emails revealing she'd pressured elderly members into signing consent forms they didn't understand. The county assembled the evidence, and the local prosecutor began to speak in language people could understand. Fraud, trespass, misuse of association funds. The word embezzlement got thrown around and then used precisely. Karen tried dramatic moves. She hosted emergency meetings and read from bylaws as if scripture could bury everything that had already come to light. She hired a lawyer and launched a defamation suit against anyone who posted the videos. She marched to my gate one last time, demanding an apology on camera. Each stunt only fed the narrative that she was scrambling to hold on a power she'd hollowed out with her own hands. Then came the twist no one expected. While sorting through the HOA's financial records for the county, an auditor found receipts that traced back to a foundation in a neighboring county run by Karen's brother. The receipts were for land improvement, but the invoices listed materials delivered to his private property, pavers for a gazebo, ornamental shrubs for his pool, a statue with a price tag that would make a conservative gasp. The trail didn't prove everything, but it did prove enough to make people ask hard questions about who had benefited from the projects Karen had championed. When the state investigator convened a press conference and read the charges, the town felt the same tightness I'd felt the night they first drove stakes into my pasture. The county froze HOA accounts pending an audit, and the board was placed under temporary suspension. Karen's phone stopped ringing from enthusiastic neighbors and started ringing with subpoenas. The same women who had clutched clipboards at her side now sat on their porches and watched the news with faces like weathered maps, tracing where they'd gone wrong. People call vengeance petty sometimes, but what I wanted wasn't petty. I wanted restitution. I wanted the stolen corner of pasture back in the hands of those who would respect it, and I wanted a community to remember what kindness looked like. The county's remedy was practical. They ordered the HOA to reimburse misused funds back into community services under strict oversight. Some of that money went to repairing damaged fences, some to paying for proper surveys for disputed properties, and some to create a small grant for elderly homeowners who needed help with maintenance. I suggested using a portion to buy materials for the community garden, because the idea of a shared green space wasn't the problem, the theft of trust was. The problem was how it had been stolen and used. Karen's last act of pride was to file a countersuit and demand punitive damages for the humiliation she claimed to have endured. The town watched the litigation like a soap opera with a moral. In court, the evidence was slow and precise rather than cinematic. The judge asked pointed questions. Witnesses testified. Delgado described the stake he'd found and the chain of surveys that proved where my land began. June testified to delivering lumber and never once being told she was building for public property. The security footage, the emails, the bank statements, they'd all been cataloged and cross-referenced until Karen's defenses felt threadbare. When the final ruling came down, it was not a public execution, but something quieter and more devastating for someone who had built an identity on control. The county ordered restitution. The HOA board was reconstituted with interim members chosen by the community. Karen was removed as president and banned from holding office within the association for 5 years. Criminal charges related to fraud were referred to a higher prosecutor who indicated a likely indictment. It wasn't gloating to say I felt a release. It was relief. Justice had a bureaucracy to crawl through, and I'd weather the storm. But the most unexpected part of all of this wasn't legal victory. It was the way the town began to stitch itself back together. People who had been divided by petty rules started mending fences, both literal and figurative. Neighbors who had been pitted against each other by Karen's edicts found reasons to talk again. Mrs. Patel hosted a small thank-you luncheon where neighbors shared stories of the Turners helping out in quiet, invisible ways. Kids who had once seen the fence as a drama backdrop now used it as a climbing frame under watchful eyes and friendly laughter. I made a choice in how to close the chapter. The Turner Ranch gate remained locked because I wasn't naive about the world, but I arranged scheduled community days where the pasture's edge would be open for workshops, a place where people could learn to mend fences, fix roofs, plant community plots, and trade skills. I took a portion of the restitution funds and, with the county's approval, established a small fund to help low-income neighbors pay for necessary repairs that the HOA had once weaponized into punishments. That felt like a better revenge than ruin. It felt like repair.